So, welcome to our series on the life of David. We're talking about different episodes in the life of David through the summertime. And I would be remiss as your spiritual formation pastor if I did not take this opportunity to encourage you to start reading your Bible if you haven't already. These are super accessible and easy stories to read, these narratives in the Old Testament. We are inundated with stories in the world that help us to see the world in a way that maybe doesn't help us to live very faithfully or deeply, like stories from Instagram and Netflix, etc. And we have to be intentional about letting other kinds of stories form us. And the stories from Scripture actually have the capacity to give us a new vision for our life and to add new meaning to our life. And so I just encourage you, especially if you have little ones, these are really great stories to engage the Scriptures. So today, we're diving into the story of the friendship between David, who is going to be the king of Israel soon, and Jonathan, the son of Saul, who is the current king of Israel. And so, picking up after last week, the story that we heard where David kills the giant Goliath, this is what 1 Samuel says. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. And there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. And Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. So if you've been tracking with us in the last few weeks, you'll know that Saul is a little bit paranoid, and he's started to fester over the story that we've read. And his behavior is super erratic. And what we see in this story is that he kind of careens from loving David and bringing him into his courts to trying to kill him with spears, throwing spears at him, and going after him to kill him. An example. Listen to this. Saul now urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. But Jonathan, because of his strong affection for David, told him what his father was planning and spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed." But then Saul changes his mind again and plans to have David killed. And David knows this and enlists the help of his friend Jonathan to escape. Then Jonathan told David, "I promise by the Lord, the God of Israel, that by this time tomorrow or the next day at the latest, I will talk to my father and let you know at once how he feels about you. If he speaks favorably about you, I will let you know. But if he is angry and wants you killed, may the Lord strike me and even kill me if I don't warn you so that you can escape and live. May the Lord be with you as he used to be with my father. And may you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love, even when the Lord destroys all your enemies from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a solemn pact with David, saying, "May the Lord destroy all your enemies." And Jonathan made David reaffirm his vow of friendship again, for Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. So, set against the backdrop of this wrestling match for the kingdom between David and Saul, there is this beautiful story of deep friendship between Jonathan and David. The scriptures use really intense language to describe this friendship. It says that David loved Jonathan as he loved himself. In some versions, it says that their souls were knit together. There were solemn pacts made, there were covenants vowed, there was the sealing of those pacts, there was the hatching and the enacting of plans, there were tears shed and lives saved. What is pictured here is clearly an intimate, close relationship. There is a friendship here where there is deep trust and loyalty. And this has led many contemporary readers and commentators to question the nature of the relationship of David and Jonathan. Were they just friends? Often this story becomes the battleground for arguments about same-sex attraction. But I would say that that misses the point entirely, no matter what side of the argument you fall on. So, let me explain. A couple of weeks ago, I learned about a new way of responding to a question that is impossible to answer because it's the wrong question to ask. You say, moo, moo. Unask the question. For instance, I have a son who likes to ask me questions like this. If my brother and I were in a race to get the most points in basketball, Mom, who do you think would win? I can't answer that question, right? Even if I have an opinion, I can't answer that question. Or he asks me impossible questions like this. Who do you think out of my brother and I has drank the most milk in our lifetime? Who comes up with that question, right? Or he ups the ante and he says, if all of your kids, Mom, were in a situation where we were all in mortal danger and you could only save one of us, who would you save? These questions are impossible to answer. Moo, dude. Unask the question. Because I think the question you're really trying to ask is, do you love me? Or am I just one of a brood of children? Do you think I'm awesome? Yes, I think you're awesome. So, was the relationship between David and Jonathan more than friends? Moo. Unask the question. Wrong question. And it's the wrong question for lots of reasons, one of which is that we're putting our own ideas of what friendship looks like, our own current ideas on the ancient world. But mostly, it's because it demeans the value of friendship, of genuine, loving relationship that isn't sexual. There is no such thing as just friends, because friends aren't just friends. Friendship is amazing. It's an amazing gift of God that is given to every human being. It's not secondary to romantic love. It's just as important. And we don't always have to be putting on the lenses of romantic love to evaluate relationships. So I wonder if the right question might be, what does it say about us that we can't read a story about friendship without sexualizing it? Instead of, what does this story say about David and Jonathan? I think a better question is, what does this story reveal about us when we read it? And I wonder if our reaction reveals that we as a church have borrowed culture's preoccupation with sex, so much so that we've lost the ability to conceive of love that is not romantic or erotic. C.S. Lewis says this, those who cannot conceive friendship as a substantive love, but only as a disguise or elaboration of eros, betray the fact that they have never had a friend. So I think the next right question would be, if you don't understand this kind of friendship, why not? Is it because you've missed out on real friendship? Do you have friends who love you, who know your troubles and share your burdens, whose good is wrapped up in your good, whose souls are knit to yours? Another way to put it is, who would you call for bail money? Because everybody needs somebody to bail them out sometimes. Even David, he had to call Jonathan to bail him out. He needed Jonathan to save his skin. And friendship, just like in this story, has the capacity to save us, to move us beyond ourselves, to increase our joy and half our sorrows. Another question I would ask us is, do we put all our stock in romantic love? Our culture peddles in the lie that there is one perfect person out there who is going to fulfill all your needs. Ask anybody who's been married for a little while, and they'll tell you the truth about that. It's kind of like going on a big grocery shop and taking one flimsy plastic bag. And then you put the milk in there and the cheese in there and the yogurt in there, and pretty soon, right, the plastic bag is ripping apart. You need more than one bag, and sometimes you need help carrying the bags too. We need community, We need one another. We need a web of relationships. We need friends. So, how do we help friendships flourish in a world that doesn't really help us know how to do that? Well, I think friendships that flourish, first of all, are covenantal, just like David and Jonathan's friendship. So there's a deep commitment to one another. We don't bail when things get bad or when we're frustrated or disappointed with one another. Instead, as Christians, we have the virtues of our faith to weather the storms. Virtues like forgiveness and kindness and humility and truth-telling and compassion. These kinds of friendships are not instantaneous. They take work and commitment, and they're often forged and deepened in hardship. But on the other hand, we also recognize that that there is freedom in friendship. Friendship isn't exclusive like romantic love, right? We invite other people into our friendships. We share our friends with others. We love our friends without dominating or controlling them. And we nurture our friendships by accepting people as they are, not on the basis of coolness. We don't curate them to make us look better. We love our friends not because they make us look beautiful, but because we see the beauty in them. So, if you don't have a friend like this, the first thing I would suggest is that you pray for one. And right on the heels of that, I would say, be a friend like this. Practice the virtues that help friendship grow. Be patient, be kind, forgive one another. Believe the best about someone. Give tons of grace. And then when you do find that friend, nurture it. Spend time with that person, value it, and thank God for it. Okay, on to our next point. I want to draw your attention back to the verse we read in chapter 18. It says this: Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. And if you were here last week, you'll remember that when David went to fight Goliath, Saul gave him his armor. And David put the armor on, and he said, no, this doesn't feel comfortable, and he took it off. So Saul tries to dress David in his armor, and Jonathan gives his clothing and weaponry to David. Just hold those while I tell you about one more piece. In the chapters we're covering today, there's the story of Saul chasing David down in one of his fits of rage. And David goes and hides with the prophet Samuel, and Saul sends some of his messengers to go and get him. So the messengers go, and when they get close to the house of Samuel, the Spirit of God comes on them, and they go into a frenzy. So Saul sends another batch of messengers, and they go, and the same thing happens. So finally, Saul decides to go himself, and this is what happens. But on the way to Naioth in Ramah, the Spirit of God came even upon Saul, and he too began to prophesy all the way to Naioth. He tore off his clothes and lay naked on the ground all day and all night, prophesying in the presence of Samuel. So you'll notice that all of these passages include references to clothing. The rejection of wearing the clothing, the giving of the clothing, the tearing of the clothing. And in the ancient Near East, the armor or cloak of the king and his heirs was representative of the kingdom, or the authority or that person held over the kingdom. It was a mantle. It was a symbol of function, of responsibility. And so when David does not accept the armor from Saul, there's a sense in which he's not accepting the kingdom from Saul, but then he accepts it from Jonathan, who is the rightful heir to the throne. And when Saul tears his robes, it's like the kingdom is being torn from Saul. It's a picture of the kingdom ending for Saul. David is now the person whom God has chosen to rule Israel. And when Jonathan gives David his robes, his tunic, his bow, his belt, his sword, it means something. It means that Jonathan is now pledging his loyalty to David instead of to Saul. He's renouncing his own claim to the throne, recognizing that David is the one whom God has chosen. So giving his clothing over to David is not just a sign of friendship. It's actually a sign of political loyalty. He enters into this conspiracy with David and with the kingdom that is coming. You see, Jonathan recognizes where the kingdom is headed, and he aligns his allegiances with it. And so there's this great reversal that happens, because friendship now becomes the sign of where the kingdom is headed, and not family ties. Listen to Jesus in John 15. I no longer call you slaves, because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. Now you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me, I chose you. Chrysostom, who was a 4th century church father, interpreted these verses this way. Jesus says, I ran after your friendship. Isn't that beautiful? God is still building a future kingdom. And it's not through blood ties, it's through friendship. It's through loyalty. And like Jonathan chose David, Jesus has chosen us to be his friends. He has chosen us to be heirs to the kingdom. He has given his mantle over to us. He has chosen us to exercise his authority and to exercise his responsibility in the world. But like Jonathan, we also have to lay something down. We need to lay down our claims on our own futures to pick up the mantle that our friend Jesus is offering us. So, do you see where the kingdom is headed? Do you see where the hope of the future lies? And is your life and are your allegiances aligned? And if not, what loyalties and allegiances do you need to lay down in order to pick up the mantle that is being offered to you? Now, if you're struggling with what this means for you, because it means something different for all of us, we all have friendship with Jesus that is unique to us, what it means to lay down your claim to your future, I would say the key is friendship. Are you friends with Jesus? Do you understand that he wants to confide in you, to be with you? He wants to help you. He wants to hear you. He wants to speak to you. He can show you what it means to pick up his mantle. Being friends with Jesus is not unlike being friends with people. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes patience, it takes commitment. So if you want to experience friendship with Jesus, this is what I suggest. Keep company with him. Hang out with him. So, first step, pray. Just turn your mind and your heart to him like we do when we pray together in these worship services. Quiet the chatter and just sit quietly in his presence. Ask him to talk to you and then listen to what he might have to say. It's actually really simple. We complicate friendship with Jesus because it's not easy, but it's simple. We make being with Jesus a lot more complicated than it should be, but we also give up a lot sooner than we should. Because becoming friends with Jesus can feel pretty vulnerable. Because when we lay down our protection, our future, we often are laying down the ways that we've navigated the world up to now, the ways that we found safety and security. We kind of lay ourselves bare. It can mean giving up things that are pretty painful to give up. And so more often than not, what gets in the way of our friendship with Jesus is not that Jesus doesn't want to be friends with us, but that we are not willing to do what it takes to be friends with him. So if this is where you're at this morning, ask. Ask for grace. Ask for a soft heart. Ask for courage. Ask that you would be able to respond to the one who has run after your friendship. Friendship with Jesus, though, isn't exclusive. So be prepared to be stretched. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistines, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals, and this was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And this made Saul super angry. "What's this?" he said. "They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king." So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. And the very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. So over and over in this story, we see Saul enter into fits of violence and jealousy. He knows that his time as king is coming to an end. He's doing his very best to cling to it. And in doing so, he does violence to his closest relationships. And we see that as Saul tries to circumvent what God's plans are for Israel, to hold on to his power, that his world becomes narrower and narrower. His suspicions, his violence, they constrict his world and they make him paranoid and alone. For instance, this passage tells us that the women sing, "Saul killed 1,000, but David killed tens of thousands." Well, we see from other passages that the intent of this song wasn't to compare, wasn't to say David killed more people, but instead to give a sense of how great the victory was on behalf of the whole. The increase of numbers isn't meant to be a qualitative difference. It's actually meant to sort of say, Team Israel for the win, like they did a great job. But Saul's vision is so narrow and his paranoia so great that he can only interpret it personally. And ironically, in trying to protect his kingdom, he ends up giving it away because his children see the violence and the anger that he shows, and they turn their allegiance to David instead of him. And I feel like I've met this person. I feel like I've met this person in myself and in other people. I've met the person who has hidden, self-protective, default storylines. And I'm sure you have too. This is what Brené Brown says. "We make up hidden stories that tell us who is against us and who is not to be trusted. Conspiracy thinking is all about fear-based self-protection and our intolerance for uncertainty. When we depend on self-protecting narratives often enough, they become our default stories." So, what's your default story right now? What are you telling yourself about how the world works? Is it self-protective? Is it shrinking your world? Well, again, Jesus has some words to say to you. "This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." In contrast to a life that is informed by this narrowed self-protection default story, Jesus invites us to open ourselves up to love by laying down our lives for one another, by making ourselves vulnerable. So what does it mean to lay down our lives for our friends? Well, it can be like intense stuff, but it can just be small stuff too. For instance, I started a home church 5 years ago, and there were 3 of us in it. 3 women. And we just trusted that, in time, if God wanted, more women would come along. We stayed open. We decided that would be one of the postures of our group together. Now this year, when we had our final huddle, one of our group members hosted, and when I arrived, there were a couple of women there. And a few minutes later, the doorbell rang, and a few more people came in, and so we grabbed our drinks, and we headed out to the backyard. There was a big sectional. We all sat down on the sectional, and then a couple more people came, and we had to shuffle over on the sectional and make more room and shuffle over on the sectional and bring in some chairs. And then finally, more people came, and we ended up having to just squeeze in right on the sectional. And at last count on that night, there were 16 of us there. And the reason that this happens is because in a simple way, the women who were there before were open to welcoming more women. They laid down their claim to safety, their claim to curate and control, and were willing to stay open and be vulnerable. In a very simple way, they laid down their lives for their friends. You see, to be a friend to Jesus means to be a friend to the world. It means holding an open posture of welcome. It means opening ourselves up to a new future where everyone is welcomed in. In giving up our need to protect, to be right, to get our own way, to stay safe, we open up the potential to be a part of something bigger than those narrow default storylines we tell ourselves all the time. We become part of a kingdom that lasts. If you need more convincing, listen to this passage that tells us the story of Jonathan's descendants after David becomes king. David summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. And the king then asked him, "Is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them." And Ziba replied, "Yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He's crippled in both feet." So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home, and his name was Mephibosheth. You can take that home and practice that one this afternoon, right? He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. And when he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. And David said, "Greetings, Mephibosheth." "Don't be afraid," David said. "I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father Jonathan. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table." And Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. What a beautiful picture of what the kingdom is like. To make friends out of potential enemies, to welcome people to our table, to shift our bums over on the sectional, to make more room. But also, what a beautiful picture for us as we're challenged to lay down the claim on our own futures. The promise that as we give up and give over our right to protect our own kingdoms, we also will be welcomed at the table. There is always room for us too. Because this, of course, is what our friend Jesus has done for us. He has welcomed us, limping and loyal, to his kingdom feast.